Incontinence is something that we're given the impression that it's a normal part of aging, or it's just part of being a woman, or that's what happens after you give birth. And this can happen to people who have never been pregnant, never given birth. It can happen to young, very, fit people who look very fit, athletes, high-level athletes. It can happen to anybody. It's absolutely not normal. It's very common and it's very treatable. And part of the reason why I'm so bullish on recommending people see a pelvic floor physical therapist once a year, even if they have no symptoms, is we should be treating the pelvic floor like we do our mouths. Like we go to a dentist once or twice a year for a checkup, and we go religiously. We go if we don't have any toothache or issues, and they do their scans and their checks, and they let us know if we have cavities or not, and then send us on our way, and we continue to brush and floss. So we should impart that same practice with our pelvic health, see a pelvic floor physical therapist once or twice a year, and then do our brushing and flossing, which is our pelvic floor exercise, in the space in between, even if we have no symptoms, because we want to be preventive.
If you haven't done so already, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below. It's a little red button. You punch that, and it's going to notify you every time we put out a new episode that can help you improve your bone health. And then also, if you haven't done so already, head over to bonecoach.com, sign up for the free 7-day osteoporosis kickstart. That's going to walk you through everything you need to be doing right now to get on the path to improvement and stronger bones. After you do those two things, go ahead and press play on this episode, and I'll see you inside. Welcome to this episode of the Bone Coach Show. Joining us today to explore pelvic floor, pelvic health, and osteoporosis is Kim Vopni. Kim Vopni is a personal trainer and menopause support practitioner known as the Vagina Coach. She became passionate about spreading information on pelvic health after the birth of her first child over 20 years ago. Kim is a passionate speaker, a women's health educator, and the author of 3 books. She began her work with the prenatal and postpartum population, where she founded her own business and co-founded a second company called Bellies Inc. She now works primarily with women in the perimenopause and postmenopause phases of life. Her Buff Muff membership is an ever-growing community where people from around the world find support through her workouts, challenges, and group coaching. Kim also certifies other fitness and movement professionals to work with women with core and pelvic floor challenges. You can find her online through her podcast, Between Two Lips, her website at www.vaginacoach.com, and on social media at Vagina Coach. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad that you're here. So let's talk about this. This is an important topic that we should discuss, and I want to talk about how you became the Vagina Coach. What was the evolution of your journey here to get to this point?
Yeah, I'm always asked that question, and I always say it's not something that I had as a job description as a little kid. Like, I want to grow up and be a Vagina Coach. But it started with really my fascination and sort of fear about pregnancy and childbirth. So I saw a childbirth video as part of our sex ed class in school, and I thought, I have no interest in that. But I went home and looked at my mom a little differently and all the women in my life, and thinking, well, they've all done it and they've survived. But then I started to watch my mom stop exercising. She eventually had surgery for urinary incontinence. She had chronic back pain. So reflecting back, at the time, I obviously didn't know what I know now, but looking back, she had pelvic floor challenges that I feel she could have avoided a lot of what she was dealing with. And so when it came time, so I grew up thinking I was never going to have children. I met my husband, decided I was going to start a family. The year prior, I had watched my sister-in-law give birth, and that was my first introduction to something different than what you see in the media. It was a midwife-assisted birth. She was in a side-lying position, so it was totally different from what I had ever witnessed. That planted a seed in me about birth is possible without injury. My sister-in-law didn't have any tearing and all the things that I had associated with why my mom had suffered. So the following year I was pregnant, I asked my midwives about how could I prevent tearing, because in my mind, if I prevent tearing, then I won't have all the challenges my mom did. And my midwife recommended a product to me. It's a biofeedback device from Germany called the Epino. And Epino stands for no episiotomy. And episiotomy is, it used to be common practice that women, when they were giving birth, the doctors would cut into the perineum, which is part of the pelvic floor, with the intention of creating more space and making it easier, but it was ending up creating more challenges. So this biofeedback device was meant to reduce the risk of tearing or having to have an episiotomy. So I used one. I had a great experience, and I thought, why doesn't everybody in the world use one of these? So I contacted the company and became a distributor, and it was not supposed to be a business. So here we are now 20 plus years later. I thought, oh, I'll just sell this on the side and that'll be that. But that sort of was the seed that really put me on this path that I didn't even know that I wanted to be on, which is learning about pelvic health and coming from a place of seeing my mom suffer and looking at pregnancy and birth as a very well-established risk factor. There's many others. But if we could get this information to women ahead of time, could we reduce the suffering that happens that's associated with the pelvic floor? So that's how it started. I originally was known as the fitness doula, so I trained as a doula as well, and I was helping women prepare for birth and optimize their recovery, focusing on the pelvic floor. Then as I started to go through my own menopause transition, I recognized that this conversation of pelvic health is really through all of our life stages, and we need different information at different stages. Well, we need all this information ahead of time, really, is what we need. But so that's when my name change happened. I was speaking at a conference, and I came up on stage, and all of the coaches or all of the people who were speaking were some sort of a business coach. It was an entrepreneur conference, and I came up on stage and joked, "Now you have a vagina coach for your business," and it stuck. So that's how it all happened.
Fantastic. And so you're also the author of 3 books.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about your books, high level. You want to share what are those books and what did they cover?
Yeah. So initially my first book was called Prepare to Push. And that was primarily, again, working with pregnant women and looking at birth as a physical event that we should be training for, just like we train for a marathon, just like we train for mountain climbing, just like we train. And birth, people always say, oh, it's like running a marathon. I argue it's like running about 5 or 6 marathons. So why aren't we training for it? And why aren't we imparting the principles of specificity? Why aren't we looking at recovery? So that's what Prepare to Push was all about. Then a second book was co-authored. So the company Bellies Inc. that I had I partnered with 2 other women, another personal trainer and a pelvic floor physical therapist. We were wanting to optimize postpartum recoveries and looking at what other cultures around the world do and looking at North America. And here we have no respect given to the need to recover, the need to retrain our bodies, and everybody's back at the gym at 2 weeks postpartum. So we embrace our belly, we show it off on Instagram throughout the 9 months. And as soon as we've given birth, it's now shameful to have a tummy and we have to look not pregnant as fast as possible. And so we wanted to shift that mentality and we created a wrap, again, leveraging what other cultures around the world do, coupled also with pelvic floor exercise. And so we would present at various fitness conferences, and Human Kinetics, which is a publisher of many different types of anatomy physiology books, approached us to write a pregnancy fitness book. So that was all about really kind of, I would say, an elaboration on Prepare to Push and how we can use fitness to train the body specifically for birth, how to optimize recovery, and also how we can set ourselves up for motherhood. Because motherhood, lifting car seats, strollers, all the twists and rotations you do, all the movements of everyday life are something that we can also train for. Then just before the pandemic, I was approached by a publisher in the UK to write a kind of an overall pelvic health book. So that book is called Your Pelvic Floor. And it was tough to write that one because it was right in the middle of the world ending with the pandemic. And so I didn't have a lot of motivation to be talking about pelvic floor health, but I had a lot of time on my hands, obviously, and got that done. So that was launched in March of 2020.
Fantastic. So for everybody listening, our audience is mostly women 50 plus that are trying to improve their bones and may have osteoporosis. But for those listening, I want you to, if you hear something that we're talking about here and you see maybe your daughter or your daughter-in-law or someone else that this is going to be relevant to, make sure you share this with them right now, because we're about to get into some stuff that's really important for pelvic floor, pelvic health. And maybe, Kim, we can just talk about what is the pelvic floor? Why is it important?
Mm-hmm. I love that you said that, first of all, because the way that we change this conversation, it's historically been very taboo. It's embarrassing. It's something we don't talk about. And there are generations that are coming that deserve this information, and it could really change the trajectory of women's health. So the pelvic floor is a group of muscles that closes off the base of the pelvis. So wherever you are sitting or standing right now, if you, and you being a male, you also have a pelvic floor. So if you find your pubic joint at the front, that is one of the attachment points for the pelvic floor. And then if you happen to be sitting, or even if you're standing, if you pull the flesh of your butt cheek away on one side, you'll feel a bit of a bony point. That's called your ischial tuberosity or sits bone. We have one on either side. The pelvic floor muscles attached there. And then at the base of our spine, we have our triangular bone of the sacrum. And then at the end, we have our coccyx, and the pelvic floor attaches to the coccyx. So those 4 points sort of make a bit of a diamond shape. There's 3 layers. So it's not just one muscle, it's 3 layers of muscles. The first layer primarily is responsible for sexual response. The second layer primarily responsible for managing the opening. So in the female anatomy, the urethra, the vagina, the anus. And third layer primarily responsible for organ support. So bladder, uterus, rectum, 3 main organs. The pelvic floor, because of its attachment points at the base of the spine, on the pelvis, it also plays a role in our pelvic and spinal stability. It's the foundation of our core. And we've all heard of core exercise or core fitness, but never has the pelvic floor been mentioned in any of our core exercise. And it also works in relationship and synergy with the diaphragm. So every time we take a breath in, ideally, the response of the pelvic floor is to lengthen. The response of the abdomen is to expand. And then as we exhale, the pelvic floor contracts and lifts. The belly naturally moves inwards. And that synergy with the breath kind of acts like a bit of a sump pump. It helps with moving things through our body as well. So these are all really important jobs that the pelvic floor is responsible for, but we've never been told anything about the pelvic floor. And it's there. We don't see it. We can see our external genitalia, but we can't actually see these muscles. We can't go to the gym and look in the mirror and flex like we do with our biceps. So it's this unknown territory. And usually we don't think about it when things are working well. But as soon as they stop working as well as they should, then all of a sudden it becomes one of the only things we think about, because it's so central to so many things that we do in our life. So that's what the pelvic floor is. Super important. And I guess my main point is that it's a group of muscles, not just one. And there's not just one Kegel exercise that's going to solve everybody's problem, which I know we're going to talk about that in a second.
Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. I want to take one more minute to talk about if you are somebody who was newly diagnosed with osteopenia or osteoporosis, and you're at a point where you're stressed, you're worried, you're overwhelmed, you have no idea where to start or how to get started getting confident in your plan. I want to tell you about the Stronger Bone Solution Program. Over 5,000 people have come through the Stronger Bone Solution Program, and it walks you through the exact process you need to fill in the missing pieces, uncover critical things in your plan that you may not be aware of, and help you make modifications, adjustments, and tweaks to get you to the place where you're building stronger bones. I want you to get confident in your plan so that you can focus on living life and enjoying the life that you deserve with the people you love most. So if that's where you want to be, head over to bonecoach.com/apply and apply for our Stronger Bone Solution Program right now. I'm Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. I want to see you inside this program. I want to help you get on the path to improvement and stronger bones. Hope to see you inside very soon. Let's get back to the episode. Yeah, of course. And it sounds very similar to how the bones are viewed too. You don't think about it until it becomes an issue, and then it becomes your primary focus. So maybe we could talk about what are some of the common signs and symptoms that we've got pelvic floor dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a huge list, and sometimes there are symptoms that you may not associate with the pelvis. So a big one is back pain, low back pain. Over 95% of women with low back pain have some form of pelvic floor dysfunction, and it is most commonly tightness. So a lot of people think if they have pelvic floor dysfunction, and we'll talk about the various types in a second, but if they think they have pelvic floor dysfunction, they immediately think, I need to tighten. I must be lax or loose. And often it can be the opposite. So incontinence is a big one. Stress urinary incontinence is where we laugh, cough, sneeze, jump, push a heavy door, do something, we exert some force that the pelvic floor is not able to manage the load of. And so we get a little bit of urine that would leak out. So we can't close off the openings. Then we have urge incontinence, which is where we're fine. Maybe we don't leak at all, but we're fine until something happens, like we hear the sound of running water, or we put the key in the front door when we come home. It's like a Pavlov's dog response. So something triggers us, and all of a sudden it becomes alarm bells, and we race and often don't make it to the bathroom in time. Sometimes we get a complete release of the bladder. You can have mixed, which is a combination of the two. You can have anal incontinence, which is where gas or stool can leak out. That's less common, but much more life altering. Incontinence is something that we're given the impression that it's a normal part of aging, or it's just part of being a woman, or that's what happens after you give birth. And this can happen to people who have never been pregnant, never given birth. It can happen to young, very, fit people who look very fit, athletes, high-level athletes. It can happen to anybody. It's absolutely not normal. It's very common and it's very treatable. So you do not have to accept pads. You don't have to think you have to wear the black crinkly underwear that's supposed to be sexy and you put it on and get on the back of a motorcycle with a handsome man. Like that's the message that we're given, that just something we need to accept. Then we have prolapse, which is statistically more common than incontinence, yet we never hear this. It's definitely not talked about in media. Don't hear it talked about with our care providers unless we were to present with symptoms that we were asking about. So prolapse is where the bladder, the uterus, and or the rectum can start to shift out of their proper anatomical position, and they can bulge into or descend into the vagina. So the bladder can bulge into the front wall of the vagina. The rectum can bulge into the back wall of the vagina. The uterus can descend from the top down into the vagina. So 50% of women who've given birth will have some degree of prolapse. And early stage prolapse can be asymptomatic. And part of the reason why I'm so bullish on recommending people see a pelvic floor physical therapist once a year, even if they have no symptoms, is we should be treating the pelvic floor like we do our mouths. Like we go to a dentist once or twice a year for a checkup, and we go religiously. We go if we don't have any toothache or issues, and they do their scans and their checks, and they let us know if we have cavities or not, and then send us on our way, and we continue to brush and floss. So we should impart that same practice with our pelvic health, see a pelvic floor physical therapist once or twice a year, and then do our brushing and flossing, which is our pelvic floor exercise, in the space in between, even if we have no symptoms, because we want to be preventive. So incontinence, prolapse, and then pelvic pain would be another bucket. So things like pain in the pubic joint, painful sex, tailbone pain, hip pain, mostly pain, is there's like so many different categories of pain, and it could be tissue related. It could be scaffolding, like bony scaffolding related. It can be muscular tension. It could be tissue integrity. There's so many different facets to the pelvic pain categories, but those would be the most common.
And what role do osteopenia, osteoporosis play in those pelvic floor challenges like incontinence and prolapse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's some research there's not a load of research, but there is some research that's looking at the links between osteoporosis and urinary incontinence. So people who have urinary incontinence are more likely to have osteoporosis, not so much osteopenia. There's another study that looked at people with higher, like more advanced prolapse. So in more advanced prolapse, there is a bulge that would be visible at the opening or outside the opening of the vagina. So that's an advanced prolapse, and it's considered an independent risk factor for fracture risk. People with lower bone density and bone quality are typically reporting more symptoms of urinary incontinence, urgency and frequency as well. Not so much the stress incontinence, but more the urgency and frequency. And the way that I look at it is, there are studies also looking at how many women stop exercising because of their pelvic floor dysfunction. So if they're afraid of leaking, if they're afraid that there's not going to be a bathroom close by, if they think, they feel that heaviness and pressure in their pelvis from prolapse, they think it's going to get worse with exercise, or maybe they've even been told by a care provider not to lift heavy, not to run, not to jump, not to do all the things that's great for our bones. So they've either self-removed themselves from exercise or been told not to. And I think now that is increasing the risk of osteoporosis and osteopenia.
Okay, so if we're trying to fix the issue or fix these pelvic floor challenges, oftentimes people think of Kegels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are Kegels and how do they work? When do they work?
Yeah, we have loads of evidence to show that Kegels do work. So Dr. Arnold Kegel is the creator of the Kegel exercise. And a lot of, I credit him because he was wanting to help his patients. And what he saw was his postpartum population was having more challenges with incontinence, more challenges with activating and relaxing their pelvic floor. So he used a biofeedback device called a perineometer that helped women see this group of muscles that, again, we can't see in the mirror. So sometimes we need visualization or biofeedback to help us. And out of that came the Kegels. So it's a voluntary contract and lift and let go of the pelvic floor. The interpretation over the last, 50, 60, 70, 80 years is squeeze. I just have to squeeze and squeeze harder. And oftentimes people are squeezing their inner thighs or squeezing their glutes, or sometimes they're holding their breath and bearing down, thinking they're doing a Kegel. And it's not their fault, because we've never, again, been told anything or taught anything about the pelvic floor. We might have been given a brochure, go home and do your Kegels, but without a proper evaluation to determine if you are actually doing them correctly, so many people do them incorrectly, and then they think that they don't work. But Kegels done correctly, consistently, well established in the literature as being effective. What I think is the limiting factor, and what now kind of supporting my bias, what the research is now coming to show, is when we combine that with resistance training, when we combine it with whole body movement, it is more effective than Kegels alone. So we need to optimize the pelvic floor. We need to understand, we need to connect with it. We need to understand that relationship with the breath. We need to understand that it's not just about the squeeze. We need to really make sure that we know how to relax the muscles as well, because tension it inhibits our capacity for power and reaction time. So once we connect and understand that, then we start to layer it into movement. So we work on a bit of coordination. It's really good brain work as well. Then we start to load it just like we would any other type of muscle when we're doing progressive overload with resistance training. But we want to have a really good foundation first so that it can manage the loads. So activities that we're doing in fitness, or just even standing up from a chair or carrying a grandchild, that's all it's increasing our intra-abdominal pressure. We all have intra-abdominal pressure. We all need it. It's part of our core control mechanisms. But when we aren't managing that pressure well, when the pelvic floor can't respond at the right time with the right amount of force, that's when we develop incontinence or organ prolapse or pain. So once we reestablish the ability to manage the pressure, get the balance between the effort and the ease, like we want suppleness, but we want strength, we want endurance, and then we load it and we start lifting heavy stuff.
And so how does someone who's doing Kegels or trying to make progress in this area, how do they know they're actually making improvement? How can they tell?
So you can, like gold standard, as I said, would be to see a pelvic floor physical therapist so they can assess for you. But you can also use your own biofeedback with your own fingers. If you happen to have a partner, they could use their fingers. If it's a male partner, they could use their penis. So can you feel that there's a gentle hug? Does it feel like it's getting stronger? Can you hold, say, for 10 seconds? And so those are sort of marks of improvement. You could lift heavier, you have less pain, your symptoms start to improve. So you can have you can get checked out or you can check yourself, but you can also monitor what it is that you are now able to do that you weren't able to do before.
Great. So you take this whole body approach to preventing or overcoming these pelvic floor challenges. What else does that entail, or what does that mean?
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the movement piece. So I kind of look at it as ABCs to start out with. We want to work on our overall alignment. There's a lot of people who we have a very sedentary population in this day and age. We have a lot of people, especially if you are afraid of leaking, if you feel vulnerable from prolapse, you may have postural adaptations of guarding and tucking and sort of collapsing almost, that is not allowing appropriate loading through our joints. So it can be increasing other challenges from a joint degeneration perspective. So we look at alignment, we look at breath, we coordinate it into movement, and that's kind of the exercise component. And most people come for the exercise. That's what they think, if I just do these exercises, it's going to be solved. But we have to also look at things like hydration. We have to look at what we're eating. Are we constipated? If we're not pooping well, we don't feel great. The pelvic floor is not going to work as well. We're going to have symptoms of urgency and frequency. And if we're constantly straining, that's another form of intra-abdominal pressure that, again, we're pushing downwards on the pelvic floor all the time. So hydration and constipation are the two most important things. Like those have to be addressed first. You can do all the exercise in the world, but if you are not pooping well and you are not hydrated, you're going to be, barely taking a step forward. A lot of people, when I say you have to drink 2 to 3 liters of water a day, they look at me like I'm crazy because they think, well, if I drink more water, then I'm going to have to go to the bathroom more often. I'm going to leak more. But so often these urgency and frequency symptoms that people have are because they are dehydrated. They're restricting their fluid, thinking that's going to solve my problem. But the bladder, the urine becomes much more concentrated because we're not hydrated. And then the bladder signals us more strongly and more often. So we think we're doing something good, but it's creating another issue. So we have to look at water. We have to look at eating. We have to look at hormones. We have to look at lifestyle. How active are you? What postures do you hold yourself in through the day? What sort of footwear do you wear? Are you peeing just in case? So again, a lot of people who are afraid of leaking or afraid of having an urge when they're not close to a bathroom are going to go to the bathroom just in case. So I'm going to go to the bathroom before I leave my house. I'm going to go to the bathroom when I get to the golf course. I'm going to go to the bathroom at 9 holes. I'm going to go to the bathroom when I'm finished. And so we start to train the bladder to signal when it's not actually empty. So again, people think it's a coping mechanism they think is helping, but they end up creating more issues. So we have to look at what sort of behaviors people have that contribute to some of the symptoms that they're dealing with as well. Sleep, stress, like the list goes on. So there's so many things that we talk about that people have these aha moments saying, nobody's ever told me that before. I had no idea. And they start drinking more water. They start changing their footwear, all these things, and their symptoms start to resolve, even if they weren't doing exercise.
I think the posture and alignment piece is so important. And it's especially when people start doing resistance training exercises too. Because it's not just about lifting and having the intensity. It's about doing it with good form, having good posture, having good alignment when you do those things. Is there like an optimal alignment that you like to see? And maybe if you want to touch on a little bit more why that's important.
Mm-hmm. So when I'm working, I don't work as much one-on-one with people in person, but we can look at a lot of things online and people can sort of self-assess. So a lot of people, when they think of good posture, they immediately think military, and they thrust their chest forward and their back, their shoulders back, and they think that's good. And while it might look better in the moment, I try to lead from the pelvis. So in a neutral pelvis, and I don't want to plant the seed that you have to be in neutral all day long. We should be moving in all various ways throughout the day. But we want to look at the times when we're standing, the times when we're sitting, when we're in a static position. How long are we in non-optimal posture that's contributing to our body's adaptations to a non-optimal state? So neutral, or what I would consider optimal, especially when we're looking at retraining the reaction time of the pelvic floor and its ability to manage loads and develop force. We want that neutral pelvis, so that the pubic joint, so if you put your fingers on your pubic joint and if you put the heels of your hands on your hip bones, so that the front hip bones there, those should be in the same plane. If I was in a tucked position, in a posterior tilt, which is very common, especially with people who are dealing with incontinence or who have been sitting a lot or who are afraid of prolapse, oftentimes the pubic joint will be out in front. So instead of those 2 points being in the same plane, they have a posterior tilt, so the pubic joint would be further forward. Not as common, but still can happen. People may be in an anterior tilt where the hip bones would be further forward and it's like an excessive arch in the low back. We want a curve in the low back. And a lot of people with a posterior tilt have very flat backs and very flat butts because we can't generate proper hip extension when we are in a tucked position. So we see flat backs, flat butts, and that posterior tilt most commonly. So when we can guide it, and also not just like me saying, okay, that's neutral pelvis, and somebody finds it and now they feel weird and they feel like they would look funny. And I'm not saying that you have to now stay in that position for the rest of the day, but we want to look at what has contributed to that. Is it the sitting? Is it the footwear? Is it that you have really short, tight hamstrings? Is it that you have tight, lengthened hip flexors. So looking muscularly, what can we lengthen? What can we strengthen that will ultimately help us find better alignment?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about pelvic tilt and how that contributes to pelvic floor dysfunction. So, what can we lengthen? What can we strengthen? Are there specific muscles and things that would be a focus depending on where the tilt is?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so most commonly that I see is tight calves, tight hamstrings. So we would want to lengthen the posterior chain. Very weak inhibited glutes. So we want to strengthen the glutes. On the front, there's a muscle called the psoas. We have one on either side. It's very intimately connected with the pelvis. It's very intimately connected with our diaphragm. And we talked about the relationship of the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. And the other thing that happens when we have that posterior tilt or even the anterior tilt, more so with a posterior tilt, we may have kind of a collapsed rib cage, very tight, restricted obliques, and we don't allow that nice expansion laterally through the rib cage. So we would want to open up the side body. We would want to open up the chest, get length there so that we can breathe better. While the other things that I've talked about, in an anterior tilt, somebody's rib cage may be further forward, so kind of thrusting further forward. And if somebody has the inability to keep the rib cage stacked over the pelvis, and every time we guide the pelvis into more neutral alignment, their ribs start to thrust forward, that's a really good indicator of restriction through the psoas. So most people, especially sedentary populations or people who sit a lot, again, also people who are guarding because of their pelvic floor, would benefit from lengthening in the psoas. And I'm not the biggest fan of psoas release where we dig into it or we put some sort of a ball and
little painful.
Yeah, no, we don't. I'm not a big fan of that. But just putting ourselves in a position where we're inviting an opportunity for release and lengthening. So I used one with a bolster where we were lying down on the bolster with the edge of the bolster just above the bra strap. So the back of the ribs have an opportunity. They have space that over time, and this could be like a 5 to 8 minute time period, if we just hang out there, again, not looking at our phones, we're not watching the news, we're just hanging out, we can let the body get into a more parasympathetic state and that rest digest. And that's where the muscles kind of are like, okay, it's safe. I can let go. And over time, it's not like doing that once is going to solve all of your problems. It's the new inputs that we give to the body that create new adaptations that ultimately down, say 2 months down the road, all of a sudden we know we don't have that back pain anymore. We've got that gentle curve back that we need. We have our booty is starting to fill up our jeans again. We don't leak. We don't have as much urgency as we used to. So it's an adaptation. It's a process, but we just need to put new inputs into the body, into the nervous system that will trigger some adaptation.
Let's say a woman has a hysterectomy, and do your changes or recommendations change based on that?
They don't change. I would say it's even more important. Hysterectomy is the most common. It's 600,000 surgeries are performed in the US alone, and the majority of them are for benign conditions like prolapse, like fibroids, like heavy bleeding. And unfortunately, like fibroids can be debilitating, and there's absolutely a need where potentially hysterectomy is the best option. But oftentimes root causes have not been looked at. We haven't looked at inflammation in the body. We haven't looked at hormones in the body. We haven't looked at posture. And so we have research that shows that hysterectomy will increase your risk of incontinence and organ prolapse, especially posterior compartment, so the rectum bulging into the back wall of the vagina. That risk is further increased if the reason you had the hysterectomy was because of prolapse. But so many people don't know the principles of alignment and breathing and coordination. And there's another exercise technique I have called the hypopressive method, which in early stage bladder and uterine prolapse in particular, people can reverse their prolapse completely or even just improve it. So potentially get away from the need to have the surgery in the first place. But if you have a surgery, if you have a hysterectomy, and there's many different types, it could be everything taken out. It could be just the uterus. It could be the uterus and cervix. So there's different ways that the uterus is removed. There's also different anatomy that is left or not left that we need to consider. However, the changes to the real estate inside, the uterus plays a role in helping suspend the top of the vagina. So you want to, if you are scheduled for a hysterectomy, or if you've had a hysterectomy, you want to ask your surgeon, how will the top of my vagina be resuspended, so I can mitigate the risk of the vagina collapsing. But all of this, everything that we're talking about, is important for everybody from a prevention perspective. Like, don't wait until you have symptoms, but also know that if you have symptoms, it's never too late. This is a lifestyle. It's something we should be doing for the rest of our life, especially if you've had a surgery. And a lot of people think that, oh, well, I had my uterus taken out, so my prolapse is fixed. I don't need to worry about it anymore. And some people are even told that by their care providers. Oh, we fixed your prolapse, or we've resuspended your vagina. You won't leak anymore. You're fine. You don't need to do those pelvic floor exercises anymore. And I argue the exact opposite. I think it's even more important because we have had changes to the landscape. We now have scar tissue, and scar tissue comes in naturally, will reduce our strength a little bit just because of that scar tissue. But we now have less blood flow, less circulation. There can be restriction in the muscle movement. So working with a trained physical therapist who can help mobilize that scar tissue is really important. So nothing changes. I would just say it's even more important post-hysterectomy that you pay attention to your pelvic health.
And I've got one other question for you about menopause transition. How does that influence the pelvic floor?
Hugely. So we talked a little bit about, we didn't really talk about it, but we mentioned hormones. And all throughout our body, we have estrogen receptors. As we are approaching and moving beyond menopause, we now are not producing our own estrogen, and those receptors all throughout our body, but we're talking specific to the pelvis right now. We have loads of receptors in the vagina, in and around the bladder. And without estrogen, those tissues become thinner, they become drier. So they're going to feel different. You'll feel itchy or irritated. You may feel burning. In extreme cases, the opening of the vagina can start to shrink and close. The labia can shrink. We may have difficulty with insertion. We may feel less pleasure. We are at an increased risk of UTIs. So as estrogen goes down, the pH in our vagina changes. We're usually very acidic in our vaginas. Now we are less acidic and we are much more prone to infection. UTIs that is one of the number one reasons why I recommend pretty much every single woman use vaginal estrogen from the start of their menopause for the rest of their life. Because most people, I hear every day, women who are in their 70s, 80s, 90s dealing with recurrent urinary tract infections who have never been offered estrogen, and they are put on antibiotic after antibiotic after antibiotic, and it becomes resistant, and it can become life-threatening. I know that sounds very dramatic, but it's true. So UTI risk, now we have also increased risk of urgency and frequency. So the incontinence symptoms, prolapse symptoms. Part of what helps us build muscle is estrogen. Part of what helps keep the suppleness of the tissue is estrogen. And when it's not there, the tissues themselves, we could do, again, all the exercise in the world, but it'll be less effective without estrogen there. So menopause is a time where if we've been able to kind of ignore the symptoms for a little while, I'll just put a pad in, it's fine. I'll do exercise later. Once we hit our menopause, all of a sudden those symptoms that have been kind of just nagging us a little bit are all of a sudden screaming at us, and we have to take action. And then people finally, usually it's on average 6.5 to 7 years that women suffer, they finally go to a doctor, and then they're put down the pharmaceutical or surgical path. And I don't want to take away from the importance of those as being options, but they should never be our first line of defense. There's so much that can be done ahead of time. Oftentimes, vaginal estrogen is a great place to start. And then, of course, your pelvic floor exercise as well.
You and I are so aligned and just some of the ways we speak about things.
Yeah.
And I noticed that as we're going through this conversation. I obviously want to tell people where they can find you, about your resources in just a minute. We'll get to that. Maybe we could share, is there a universal quick win or actionable step that people can take just even listening to this right now? Mm-hmm. So we talked about Kegels, but is it make sure you do a minimum of these number of Kegels a day? Or is there something else that's like a foundational thing That's just a quick win for people.
Well, a quick win is always, I say go see a pelvic floor physical therapist. Not everybody has access to one geographically or financially, but that is always my top recommendation. The other would be to, sit less, move more. That doesn't mean standing is always, like, don't stand all day if you've been accustomed to sitting all day. Move with diversity throughout the day. Find that pelvic alignment with the pubic joint and the hip bones in the same position. Think about blossoming your vulva. Think about blossoming your butt cheeks and letting the tension go that we've been holding on to for so long. That I think could be a fairly quick win for people. Their back will hurt less. They'll have less urgency and frequency over time. Again, not necessarily right away. But another really big one is just drink more water. I know it sounds kind of boring, but drinking more water can make remarkable change to your symptoms of urgency, frequency, and constipation.
Great. And are there any things, what have we not discussed that you think is important for the women out there listening, or maybe their daughters?
The only other thing I think that we didn't touch on is the importance of the hips. So I talked about a whole body approach, but the hips are mobility in the hips, but also strength in our hips is really important for the pelvic floor. And people who have had a hip replacement or who are maybe dealing with degeneration within the hips are typically going to experience more symptoms of incontinence before. Depending on the type of surgery they have, anterior is typically more favorable for incontinence symptoms. If somebody has a posterior or a lateral repair, they will often generally experience more incontinence afterwards, or have a harder hill to climb post-op. So mobility and strength of the hips is really, really important. And there was a cool research study that looked at a combo maneuver that used the glutes, the inner thighs, the transversus, and the pelvic floor. So an exercise that would say like a bridge exercise. So you're laying down on your back, you put a ball or a cushion in between your thighs, and your feet will be fairly close to your butt. So your shins will be vertical. You would inhale and lengthen the pelvic floor. You would exhale. A good cue for activating the pelvic floor is to think about sipping a smoothie through a straw with your vagina, or picking up blueberries with your vagina and your anus. And then you press up into your bridge while also squeezing the ball. And that gets the glutes, it gets the inner thighs, the transversus, the deep abdominals co-contract with the pelvic floor. So that's a really good and better than Kegels alone exercise. And just to touch on one last thing that you had said, if you look at literature, it'll say 3 sets of 10-second holds 3 times a day. That's what the gold standard Kegel exercise would be. And again, the limiting factor is that doesn't train the pelvic floor dynamically. We could sit and do 3 sets of 10-second holds 3 times a day. I don't know many people who are going to do that. Compliance is very low. Sure. It's pretty boring. Yeah. But it does, that is, it is established that it will help, but we need to get up and be against gravity. And when we are also doing movement that will strengthen the hips, that will also in turn help strengthen the pelvic floor.
Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Bone Coach Show. If you're finding it helpful, please leave a positive rating and review. Hit that like button, subscribe to the podcast or the channel. That lets us help more people and reach and serve more people. And it also lets us know that this is helpful to you on your journey to better health and stronger bones. And then also, right down in the show notes, you can actually find a link to my free Bone Healthy Recipes Guide. That's going to give you access to some amazing and delicious recipes to support your journey to stronger bones. And then also, we have a link to my free Stronger Bones Masterclass in the show notes too. And that is the 3-step process that has helped people in over 1,500 cities around the world get confident in their plan for stronger bones. Over 110,000 people have taken part in this, and it's been really, really helpful for them. And I want you to have free access to it too. So add your name and email right down there in the show notes, get access to that free Stronger Bones Masterclass, and let's get you confident in your Stronger Bones plan today. That's fantastic. Kim, this was a great interview. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your expertise. I'd love for you to share also where people can find you and your resources.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it was a great chat. I appreciate it. VaginaCoach.com. If you go to Google and put Vagina Coach, you'll find me somewhere. I've got free content on YouTube. and I share on social media as well. And then you can find out about my programs or my books on my website at vaginacoach.com.
Fantastic. Kim, thank you again so much for your time. For everybody listening, you can find all the resources, show notes, everything mentioned here today over at bonecoach.com. We'll see you in the next episode. Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. Hope you found that episode helpful and that you enjoyed it. Just one last reminder, if you haven't done so already, head over to bonecoach.com, sign up for your free 7-day osteoporosis kickstart. It's going to tell you everything you need to do to start getting on the path to improvement. Hope you found this helpful. I'm your Bone Coach, Kevin Ellis. I'll see you soon.